right, thank you, David, and thank you everyone that has tuned in today. Usual disclaimer. All right, EMVision. So those of you that aren't familiar, we're developing novel portable medical imaging, originally out of the University of Queensland. And when you think about the mainstays in imaging, you typically think about CT and MRI. They both produce exquisite images. They're very expensive, very complex, and they're stationary. So when we think about bringing imaging to the patient, it's really ultrasound that's been a game changer. It's used for a wide range of different applications. There's around 300,000 ultrasound units deployed worldwide, but it's very poor at imaging the brain. The ultrasound waves bounce off the skull. So what we're doing is developing a device that has much of the same value proposition as ultrasound, non-invasive, can be brought to the patient. We can actually image the brain at the point of care. So what I want to show is a short video to give the audience a bit of a sense of technology. You'll see here, so that's our clinical prototype. It's about the size of a mid-range ultrasound unit. And like ultrasound, it can be brought wherever the patient is, so by the bedside, it can be moved in between beds, easily stored. And that on the right is Robert Tiller. He's our head of design. He worked with CEO Rob Weinberger on the design and development of the original trophon device by Nanosonics. So the way our technology works is there's a headset, and within that headset is a ring of antennas. They send low power RF signals into the brain. They're not dissimilar from what a mobile phone would use to transmit voice and data. There's no ionizing radiation that one would receive with a CT scan. What you're seeing now is the concept images for our next generation device, which is well underway. And what we're doing is miniaturizing a number of the key components, including the vector network analyzer that measures the signals sent by a headset. And that device will be a cut down, robust version intended for commercialization. We're aiming to have that built around the middle of next year. So the technology itself has applications across the whole body. We're focusing on time-sensitive neurological disorders first. Stroke. So why stroke? Well, it's a huge health economic burden. It's around $80 billion a year in the US. It's around $6 billion in Australia. It's a massive societal burden. It's a leading cause of death, a leading cause of disability. It's around 65% of stroke survivors that will experience some form of permanent disability. But what's really important is there are effective treatments. They're time sensitive. Before they can be administered, clinicians need to understand, is the stroke a result of a blockage, ischemic, or is it a bleed, a hemorrhagic? The drugs that are given to a patient to help dissolve a blockage, if given to a patient with a bleed, can worsen the bleed and prove fatal. So you don't want to get them wrong. They're both time sensitive. So it's that kind of information, the subtype differentiation, that we aim to provide at the bedside with our first generation device. And then moving into the future, our second gen is geared towards road and air ambulance, so ultra lightweight, essentially bringing the stroke unit to the patient. Now, why bedside? Well, after patients have received treatment and they're in the ward recovering, they may be in a stroke ward, they may be in neurology, they may be in ICU. There's a whole host of complications that can occur. So those patients that receive the clot thinning drugs known as thrombolysis, around 5 to 6% of those will go on to develop a bleed. Those that have a clot physically retrieved by thrombectomy, around 15 to 20% will go on to develop a bleed. And a bleed can prove fatal, as I mentioned earlier. So being able to intervene earlier can have a big impact on the patient's recovery. And it's very challenging to move these patients down to radiology, particularly if they're unwell. Ties up a lot of resources, and there's also a risk of complications during transport. So that's the space we're playing. We're not looking to displace CT or MR, provide clinicians with valuable information by the bedside to intervene earlier, and also open the door for continuous monitoring applications that haven't been possible prior. So even observing changes in a patient's condition before the physical clinical symptoms present. So that's a new opportunity as well. Now, we recently reported very encouraging results of our pilot clinical trial. That study's been conducted at the Princess Alexandra Hospital in Brisbane, 30 stroke patients. The intention of that study was to collect data from stroke patients to allow us to tune our imaging algorithms and see how they correlate with CT and MR, the ground truth. So patients that were enrolled received a CT, some received both, and a scan with the EMVision device within close proximity. So there were 21 ischemic, 9 hemorrhagic, And a really important figure there is the NIHSS score. So that's a tool that healthcare workers will use to assess the severity of a stroke. It goes all the way up to 42. What 5.2 tells you is that within this cohort, there was a large number of small to moderate sized strokes. A few examples across ischemic and hemorrhagic. Now, on the left, you'll see a series of ischemic strokes. These are the ground truths, MRIs, and you'll see the area of injury highlighted with the red circle. You can see it here. And then in the middle, you'll see our fusion algorithm. And the easiest way to think about fusion is it takes the signals of greatest intensity from several of our algorithms and combines them together into one image. So you could almost think of it as a classic hits album. That's how it works. We have several algorithms that create an image. Fusion takes the signals of greatest intensity. And what you can see is a really nice correlation between the ground truth and the fusion images. And then we have a classifier that overlays classification weighting. Is it ischemic? Is it hemorrhagic? And this is AI driven, and there's opportunity in the future to add a confidence level to this, to essentially think of it as a traffic light system. So blue ischemic, red hemorrhagic, and orange low confidence weight. So that certainly opened the door to making our images easier to interpret for neurologists, radiologists, even paramedics. Now, on the right-hand side, similar story, but a series of hemorrhagic patients, MRIs, this is CT. You can see again, very nice correlation between the fusion images. You can see the classifier. Now, what's quite interesting with all these images is some are very clear, where in the ground truth between the abnormal and normal tissue, others are very subtle. Whereas what you'll see with our images is there's a very clear differentiation between abnormal and normal tissue. So from the 30 patient cohort, we were able to observe an accuracy of 93 to 96% in subtype differentiation, and then between 86 to 96% in localization against the same quadrant for CT and MRI. It was a prototype, but we collected patient and operator feedback, and we're quite pleased with the feedback that we received. In terms of upcoming milestones, we're expecting feedback from the FDA this quarter on our pathway forward. We're also part of a group known as the Australian Stroke Alliance. It brings experts in stroke, paramedics across the country, Royal Flying Doctor Service, consumer advocacy groups together. They are helping us plan for our expanded studies. And we're also part of a Medical Research Future Fund grant bid. It is a competitive process. We're one of 10 groups that are shortlisted. We don't know how many groups the government will fund, maybe one, maybe two, maybe three, we don't know. But if successful, it would provide non-dilutive funding to EMVision to accelerate our first responder model development. So moving into next year, planning out those expanded studies, there'll be updates around our next-gen device development. We'll also be enrolling an additional 20 patient data set at the PA, and we have a number of fantastic collaborations already in place. Plan to expand upon those, and there'll be further FDA engagement as we move into those larger studies. I just want to give a quick snapshot on what's occurring around the world with mobile stroke units. So there's around 30 or so that have been running for the last few years. Bottom line is they work. They dramatically reduce the time to treatment for stroke patients. And you can see some of the results out of the Melbourne stroke unit there. Now, the challenge is you can't put a CT, even a cut down 500 kilo CT, in every ambulance. You could potentially put an ultra lightweight, cost effective, portable device in every ambulance. And that's certainly our intention with our second generation device. And also addressing some of the disparity in rural remote locations. So there's around, if we take Australia as an example, there's around 8 million people that live in rural, remote and Indigenous settings that have virtually no access to stroke treatment. It's around 3% of those patients that will be treated in a stroke unit versus 77% in metropolitan areas. So there's a great disparity there. So also deploying lightweight imaging via services such as the Royal Flying Doctor Service could have a big impact. Now, on revenue models, we're keeping an open mind at this point in time. What's increasingly popular in the US is a monthly subscription model where the device will be bundled in, training, software upgrades, PACS integration, maintenance, consumables, everything included on a monthly service fee. And then the more common model is capital equipment sales up front, consumables, we have a single-use cap per patient, then maintenance as an on-needs basis. So in terms of the total addressable market, if we're looking at stroke wards, ICU and emergency departments, we're looking around 10,000 units in the US, in Germany, France, UK, close to 6,000. And then you can see road and air ambulance is much larger still. So it's a very significant total addressable market. Just finishing up on the team, Rob Weinberger, our CEO, is the former MD of Nanosonics. He was there very early on. He led their expansion into the US, set up a distribution agreement with GE, which I understand is still in place today. He's brought on a couple of his former colleagues from Nanosonics, Farouk Andon, who heads up our program management, Ruth Kremen, who leads our regulatory affairs. She was also a regulatory specialist at Cochlear before Nanosonics. On the technology front, we're very fortunate to have Stuart Crozier. He is a co-inventor. 2/3 of all MRs use IP he has developed. It's well known the world over for his work in that space. And Constandy, another co-inventor, is an EM imaging expert. We also have an ongoing relationship with the University of Queensland. So there's about 20 or so very talented researchers led by Professor Nina Bush working on the background on the next generation. Finally, Dr. Philip Dubois joined us very recently. He's a neuroradiologist. He is the former CEO of Sonic Healthcare Imaging, brings deep clinical expertise as well as commercial connectivity. And we have a fantastic clinical advisory board across interventional radiology, stroke neurology, and critical care. All right. Thank you all.
Scott, a great presentation. Clearly an innovative technology playing in a really, really important space. How do you get through the regulatory pathway, both in Australia, but then in other markets?
Sure. So what we're doing right now is we've submitted an FDA 513G, which is essentially a request for classification on our pathway. So 510K, 510K de novo, or PMA. So that will give us a bit of clarity on the path forward, but then we'll develop our protocol for our expanded studies and we'll share that with the FDA via the Q submission process. So what they'll do is they'll give us feedback on that protocol before we enter our trial. So our intention there is to set it up to be successful, to ensure that we're generating data that's going to satisfy the FDA before we run it. And then really, you know, if you're meeting the FDA standards, there's a lot of, I guess, uniformity with CE and TGA as well.
And in terms of, and I know you're talking primarily about your first gen device, but clearly the interest in the next gen device being able to be used in smaller or in more compact locations. How small does it need to be, and what's sort of the pathway to get to that point?
Sure. I think, well, look, the fantastic scenario would be DFID equivalent, think Packer-Wacker. And it is very early stage, but we do have a wearable preclinical prototype that is being tested in the background at the University of Queensland. That it is early stage, but it does show a lot of promise, and that is incredibly lightweight. The largest physical component of our device outside of the trolley is a unit called the VNA, or the Vector Network Analyzer, and that's made by a company called Keysight. It allows us to measure the signals our headset sends and receives. We have a collaboration with them to drastically reduce the size of that unit, and we're receiving our first prototypes this quarter. So, and I can tell you they're probably give you an example. They're about that size, so a lot smaller. So we're certainly well on the way to further miniaturizing the technology.
And what would be the main barrier to that? Is it just being able to shrink things down to the size it would need to be able to be portable?
Look, it really is the VNA. People's heads are the size they are. Some people have the head the size of a Chihuahua, some the Great Dane. You know that you need to accommodate all head sizes, and today we have a membrane within our headset that inflates and deflates to accommodate different head sizes. So I can't see much changing there. It's really around the VNA.
And in terms of the evolution of the product, is it envisaged that it is robust enough that it can, you know, the current version 1 operate pretty much anywhere in any conditions and eventually without a power requirement?
Yeah, onboard power. That is the intention. There is a fairly meaningful verification and validation process that we need to go through, and that would be part of any regulatory submission. But that's certainly the intention.
And I've got a very good question here, and it's a little bit long, so bear with me. I note that most of the strokes examined in the 30-patient cohort were minor strokes. Would minor strokes be more difficult to detect than better results for the EMV device? So it seems like you've gone to some of the harder stroke types first as part of your initial tests.
Yeah, look, there weren't any layups as such. There was a pretty good mix, but having a large number of small strokes and being able to see those certainly gives us confidence.
And
I will reiterate, we're not trying to replicate the capabilities of an MRI. That's not the intention.
And from a competitor perspective, taking aside the MRI, as you mentioned, one of the comments here was surely someone else has got to be doing this. It just seems so obvious when you explain it the way you do.
Yeah, well, so Ron and I went to one of the largest medical imaging conferences in Chicago back in, it feels a long way away, but back in November last year, and everyone exhibits there, all the majors. And, we obviously had a good look at their own portfolios and met with some of the execs there. No one really has anything quite like our device. A few companies are working on cutting down existing CTs or existing MRs, but they're still, 400 or 500 kilos. There's a few companies looking at EM microwave imaging, mostly out of academic institutions in Europe. They have made some progress, but from what we've seen, they aren't able to localize and classify strokes, and some of the hardware's certainly a lot larger than ours. So, look, it's a big market. There's a lot of interest in the market, but I think we've got a pretty good head start.
Scott, as I leave you with this final question, how proud are you of what's been achieved today, and how excited are you for what's coming?
Look, we're very pleased. I mean, that trial that I referenced earlier, that's the first time our technology has been used in stroke patients. So it is a small cohort, but it gave us fantastic confidence, right? And every clinician we show it to is incredibly enthused around the potential the technology can have. Still a long way to go. So, one step at a time.
And the excitement for the future?
Well, we'll get our second generation unit built, larger study. We want to see that successful, and we'll take it from there.